Diplomacy. The results of French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to China crossed the seas on Tuesday, a day after military exercises officially ended, as Chinese warships continue to operate near Taiwan. Across Atlantic, Macron's remarks that Europe risks getting involved in crises that are not ours with regard to Taiwan have sparked criticism even when French president tried to outline his vision for future of European sovereignty during a visit Netherlands. Read advertisement. While President Emmanuel Macron traveled to Beijing last week for his first French presidential visit to China since the COVID pandemic, experts said the trip would require an act of balancing following a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Beijing ally Russia. But Macron appeared to be vacillating on the diplomatic thread when, fleeing Beijing, he insisted that Europe should set its own policy on Taiwan in order to avoid being a follower of Washington's agenda in the region. The reaction across the Atlantic was swift and harsh. A scorching editorial in the Wall Street Journal on Sunday read, "Emmanuel Macron is 21, including moving Europe away from the United States. For the 21st century, he sees himself as Charles de Gaulle. Nobody wants a crisis over Taiwan, let alone hastening crisis, but preventing it requires credible deterrence," the editorial continued. Macron's visit last week came as Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen met with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy during a break in California, prompting Beijing to launch military exercises around the autonomous island. The three-day military exercises, which began on Saturday, came a day after Macron left China. People familiar with Macron's idea said they were happy that Beijing was at least waiting for him to leave Chinese airspace before launching the simulated Taiwan siege exercise, Politico said in its report. While China has embraced the French president's program in its military drill plans, it has done little to alleviate Taiwan's security concerns. Taiwan's defense ministry has drawn condemnation from Taiwanese politicians, saying on Tuesday that Chinese warplanes and Navy ships are still in waters around the island, a day after exercises officially ended. The results of Macron's controversial comments are not limited to France's overseas allies. Closer to home on continent, the French president's call for European autonomy from U.S. foreign policy has exposed divisions within EU. As Macron landed in the Netherlands on Tuesday for state visit, which included a speech on European sovereignty, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki was boarding plane to the United States. Speaking to reporters before boarding plane, Morawiecki stressed that an alliance with the United States is absolute foundation of European security. Some Western leaders dream of collaborating everyone, with Russia and some forces in the Far East, he said. Morawiecki may not have given names of the leaders involved, but thorny comments left little doubt as to goal of his remarks. Undulating waters in the Indo-Pacific. Macron has long advocated the concept of strategic autonomy for Europe, and his comments on Taiwan reflect his emphasis on making sovereignty a priority for the 27-member EU bloc. The roots of France's diplomacy of balance can be traced back to General Charles de Gaulle's attempts to counter U.S. domination, as the Wall Street Journal editorial suggests. Under de Gaulle, France became the first Western country to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1964. But nearly 60 years later, with China demonstrating its military might on land and at sea, many Western foreign policy experts have little patience for Macron's balancing act. With its overseas territories in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, France sees itself as an established power in the Indo-Pacific. China is expanding in Pacific, France has important territory in the South Pacific, and you can't just say, "It doesn't matter, Taiwan is a long way from Pacific," said June Teufel-Dreyer. He is a political scientist from the University of Miami in France 24's The Debate program. China is also active in the South Pacific. Where do you think this is the place to stay in China? Or do you go down in history like Neville Chamberlain? He asked, referring to the British Prime Minister, who was known for Adolf Hitler's soothing foreign policy that enabled him to expand German territory in the 1930s. Not strategic autonomy, but strategic nonsense, with its strategic interests in Indo-Pacific and its balanced diplomacy, France hesitated to be drawn into the Sino-American competition and promoted multilateralism as a balance against increasing polarization in region. But it was easier to maintain this position before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and as Beijing approached Moscow. While Beijing has officially taken a neutral stance in the Ukraine war, it has stepped up its calls for a multipolar world order in an attempt to counter Washington's unipolar hegemony position echoed by Moscow. In this context, Macron's ongoing focus on strategic autonomy seems to have taken a leaf off Chinese President Xi Jinping's diplomatic playbook. Earlier this year, China's top diplomat Wang Yi shuddered at the Munich Security Conference by lecturing an audience of mostly European leaders on the EU's foreign policy imperatives, as Beijing sees it. Wang said at the meeting in Germany, "We must think calmly about what role Europe should play to assert its strategic autonomy, especially our friends in Europe." Experts on both sides of the Atlantic have long understood the principle of strategic autonomy, France's main foreign policy. But they were angry at timing Macron's recent statements at a time when Washington's support for Ukraine has invested billions of dollars in European security and the Unity West is seen as particularly important. Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Relations and former advisor former U.S. President Barack Obama, said, "Macron does not want Europe to be caught up in crises like Taiwan that are not ours. But he's good at relying on U.S. security commitments to address crises in Europe like Ukraine." In a Twitter post, Daalder said it was not strategic autonomy. "This is strategic nonsense. Macron does not want Europe to be caught up in crises that are not ours like Taiwan. But he's good at relying on U.S. security commitments to address crises in Europe like Ukraine." Psi 8G6C97Y, Ivo Daalder, April 9, 2023. Optical properties of a debilitating deterrent. The real problem, according to many experts, was the blurred messages about deterrence, a foreign policy imperative in the era of Russian expansionism. I can certainly agree that Europe may not want to follow the lead of the United States, but from what I see, France has no interest in what is happening in Taiwan.